Hello, everyone. Welcome. This is the second in a series of 5 conversations that have been put together by Johnny Wigan and Emma Hay at the Edinburgh International Cultural Summit and Edinburgh International Festival. Across the series, they're bringing together artists and makers from Scotland and around the world to explore the cracks and fissures in the arts exposed by these events that we're all living through. Thank you so much for joining us. You'll know by now, all of you, that working and communicating like challenging. We'll do our best. We have got some flaky broadband going on, so bear with us if anything is interrupted. We're going to try and make this as much of a conversation as we can, so I'll attempt to keep dialogue moving, but do, again, bear with us if we get interrupted by kids or dogs or freeze or whatever it is. We have about an hour. During that time, you can ask us questions, and the facilitators behind the scenes will bring them into us. We'll move to them towards the end of that hour. Afterwards, we're hosting a Zoom, a sort of decompression session. Do join us. There's a link in the email that you will have got, and you use your email address to come. I'll remind you about that again at the end. We're joined by 2 BSL interpreters, Catherine King and Jill Wood, who will swap periodically. You'll see them on the screen the whole time. We've also got 2 live captioners, Orla Pearson and Claire Harvey. Thanks in advance to the 4 of them. The title of this session is Future Gazing, and I'm joined by a group of very brilliant visionary people who have spent much of these strange few months, and indeed their careers, bringing together bright, creative minds and dreaming us into better, more fair worlds. It's obviously quite an urgent task right now. I'll get them to introduce themselves and also their work in a moment. My name's Suzy Glass. I'm a producer, I'm a consultant. I work across creative disciplines and wherever I can across industries. I like to build projects that attempt to grapple with complex questions and connect ideas with people. I'm really interested in transformational innovation and how creativity is deployed within society to enable change, and that's where we'll focus a lot of this conversation. I'm hoping we'll look at some of those phases of change, how creative practice does, can, might, should fold into that. Questions in my head the whole time are: who gets to create vision? Who maps the journeys of imagination we need to navigate? How can the work that those of us do in the creative and cultural sectors intermingle meaningfully with the work that our friends and our neighbours do in health, in education, in care, in planning, in the legal system, and so on? So some of the things we'll attempt to address, wish us luck. As the cracks open up in our fragile world, we find ourselves faced with huge challenges, and I would say also huge opportunities. So how do we imagine an ecosystem that has the power of creativity and imagination at its heart? What benefits will it bring? Where have things like this been achieved so far? Why is it so difficult to embed elsewhere? And crucially, how do we make this a more prevalent way of existing as we move towards the middle of a century that to me already feels fraught and exhausted? Right, we're going to move on to the panelists. We'll start with Emily. Emily, would you like to tell us a little bit about you, your context, and give us something that's made you feel hopeful over the past 6 months or so?
Hi, thank you, Suzy. My name's Emily Sexton. I'm joining you all from the lands of the Wurundjeri and Bunurong people on the Kulin Nations, commonly known as Melbourne in Australia. We're currently in what's called Australia here a stage 4 lockdown, which means we're under curfew. We can leave our house for an hour a day for exercise, and there are 4 reasons to leave the house. That's it. As artistic director of Arts House, I am Arts House is a theatre venue in Melbourne. It's also part of the city government, so it's been an interesting time to be part of a civic context, and it's one that is grappling with some really challenging circumstances for what civic society's function and purpose should look like in a new future. Sometimes that's been inspiring because someone said early on, government loves a crisis, and I felt that at the beginning, and now I feel something else. And as our children are at home for longer and longer, and we all move into various stages of exhaustion and sadness and grief, I'm curious about the artistic works that can emerge that don't just in various nuanced and beautiful ways explain to us how to look on the bright side, but also allow us to howl in the dark. I think art can be really good at that, and it's hard to find the place to for artists to sort of create that kind of release, which I feel like people need. One of the most hopeful moments, I will say, is that as Arts House, we have been working on a project for the last 5 years called Refuge, which is looking at the intersection of art, emergency and crisis, and climate change. And talking to those artists who have been privileged to work on that project and spend time with elders, Aboriginal elders on our country here in Melbourne, they are uniquely resilient and uniquely prepared for this kind of existence where everything feels like it's out of control. So talking to artists who have spent time in multidisciplinary conversations with scientists, with emergency service workers, with elders, they're in a uniquely good position, and that gives me hope for the kinds of methodologies and practices that we might employ going forward. That maybe they'll give us more preparedness for the next kinds of crises that we're going to be facing. Yeah. Did that answer your question, Suzy?
Brilliant. Thank you, Emily. We'll move on to Graham.
Cool, thank you. Hi, my name's Graham Hogg. I'm one of the directors of a company called Lateral North, and we're based in Glasgow in Scotland. Our practice started 6 years ago, looking at how Scotland can engage further with the Nordic and Arctic nations. And as the title that came up underneath my name there has suggested, we've actually, during lockdown, developed another project that's called After the Pandemic. So I'm one of the people who have been curating that from the Lateral North side, but we've also worked alongside two of our friends, Fergus Bruce and Laura McHard, to develop this initiative, which really looks at Glasgow and how the city can change to be greener and more resilient in the face of this pandemic, but also in terms of other future pandemics or challenges such as the climate emergency as well. So we very much see this as like a linear timeline that we're on, that we go from the pandemic through to carbon neutrality and effectively trying to address the climate emergency that we have. As part of the After the Pandemic initiative, we have, over the past 6 months, we've been working with a variety of different disciplines. And I think, like, in terms of if I'm being asked what have I been hopeful about, it's about the variety of people who I've engaged and worked alongside over the past sort of 6 months. In particular, we worked on a project called After the Pandemic Summer School, where we invited, over the course of June, we asked people to contribute their ideas for how Glasgow could change, and we hosted a series of briefs that people had to respond to. From that, we had not only architects, which is our background, but we also had graphic designers. We had people who are performing artists. We had people who developed apps. So there was like a huge variety of output that was created in the space of 1 month that we're now looking to take forward alongside the Glasgow City Council, which responds to the pandemic. But I think the thing that was really hopeful from all of that was the opportunity to involve not just people of a certain discipline, but also of like completely different ages. So we've had people contribute from the ages of 14 up to, like sort of 50, 60 years old. It was different genders, different people with different from different ethnicities. and also we've also worked alongside people who experience the city differently, such as one of our friends who has mobility challenges was one of the contributors to it as well, looking at the city through his lens. So I think that from our side is the really inspiring part about or the really hopeful part of what we've been involved with so far, of engaging with such a wide variety of people about reimagining the city as it is.
Great, thank you. So the third of our panelists, we're going to go to JK. Same for you, JK. If you introduce yourself, tell us where you are and what the context is where you are, and also something that's making you feel some hope.
Hello. Yes, thank you, Suzy. Hi, I'm JK ANICOCHE. I'm a performance maker based in Manila, in the Philippines, and I'm one of the directors of Comunidad X, an anti-disciplinary collective working at the intersection of art, development, and culture. I also lead the Sipatlawin Ensemble, or Sipatlawin Incorporated, which creates performances with various communities across the archipelago and in various lands. Currently in the Philippines, we are plagued with two crises. Of course, there's a pandemic, and what became more apparent in the past few months in the pandemic is the cultural crisis that we are facing with all the challenges in the politics where people are being engaged. So I think because of this pandemic, we as artists have faced the challenge of how to assemble and how to gather and rethink about ideas of participation. I was leading a festival called the Virgin Lab Fest for new works by playwrights at the Cultural Center of the Philippines, and pretty much at the beginning of the pandemic and the lockdowns. So the intention is to capacitate artists in translating or even migrating processes online. Um, and currently we are working with Contemporary Ritual Makers festival in December, where we are asking artists and development workers to rethink the idea of participation and civic engagement. Um, I think the good thing that came out of this of this experience and where hope lies is in the idea that now I think a lot of artists have been shifting thought or the point of view from merely looking at the arts as an economic exchange or an economic or a capital. Now artists are looking deeply into ecological connections with an ecological eye. A lot of collaborations across different lands and practices and cultures have been born for the past few months. And now is the time that people are collaborating, not just from different fields of expertise, but also from different cultures. So now we're thinking even in Asia, this thought of mobility and gravity, even though we are working in our remote spaces. So there's an emerging there are emerging forms of ways of togetherness, and a lot of people are thinking about that, even though at times it feels so isolating, and it feels that collective action is almost impossible if we are not in a physical shared space, shared time. So and lastly, I think now there's more intergenerational conversations, and we are also looking into indigenous practices, and not just about the pandemic, but also in the conversation of climate. Yeah, so that's it for now. I hope I answered the question.
Yeah, no, that's great because there's a huge amount to work with. There's so many places I could go immediately. I'm going to stick with my script just for now. What seems clear to me as I've been doing the work I do over the past few months is that our relationship in our sector, for many of us, with purpose has clarified and become more urgent. And I wondered whether the three of you had anything to say about whether you felt that same shift in, I guess, need to create impact and to contribute to the narrative of how we live, and whether you could talk about how you've done that a little bit more, if it feels relevant. I'll start with you, Emily. Pass if you don't want to answer, but
no, these are absolutely the sort of questions that have been rolling around in my head, Suzy. You've nailed it. For us, I think there's a very strange experience of being locked out of a theatre for a long time, and so you start to think through, well, should we or do we decouple entirely from place? And we've been running a big digital program. We actually conceived it 2 years ago. It's called Bleed Festival. You can visit at bleedonline.net. So we already had, over the last 2 years, been considering the relationship between live and digital forms. And so we think very deeply about what we like in that space, what works, and also what doesn't work. And we sort of charging at the question of how the internet feels with a very critical lens, and one that asks, well, why are we doing this? Why are we sort of lurching ourselves into that space, and what happens when we do? So we have been thinking about that for some time. And I think as a result, I've also been thinking about the opposite, which is the role of place, what it means to stand on at North Melbourne Town Hall, which is our theatre, and what it means to conceive a program that can be of that and also beyond it. But I just keep coming back to the responsibility we have to those North Melbourne and West Melbourne communities. In particular in Melbourne, near where we are based, there was a pretty dramatic and shocking moment where some of the most vulnerable members of our community who live in housing estates were with zero notice put into the most strict of lockdowns. And I think it was coming from a place of panic on behalf of the government. They obviously saw data that indicated that there was some widespread the virus was widespread in the communities, but they really didn't work with community leaders in the way that would be best practice. And so as those people are our neighbours, we think really acutely now about what we do next, and what our responsibility is to our local, to our neighbours, basically. So I think, when I think about how we do what we do and with purpose, I mean, it's our purpose to make art, to make shows, but and I feel more passionately about that than ever. But it is also equally our purpose to think deeply about who that's for, and holding those two things at the same time, holding generosity at the same time as you're holding urgency of purpose. I think that's the kind of drive that is sort of, I guess, taking me forward and out of this particular moment.
Okay, thank you. Graham, same question for you. And I guess what we're wrangling here actually is with how roles are changing and shifting, or we want them to change and shift, perhaps.
Yeah, cool. I mean, I think that in terms of the way that we operate as a business has completely changed as well. But I think I just wanted to maybe touch on like two things. So, firstly, I think that our idea for a better future is that we're looking for something that is much more local and much greener and more resilient. And I think I had an experience that I am sure has been reflected by lots of other people throughout the world, when I've actually become I've learned a lot about the region or the area that I live and stayed for the majority of lockdown. So during lockdown, I stayed in a flat. I overlooked a park that I barely visited, and because of lockdown, I have effectively been in touch with a guy who lives in Canada, who is the great grandson of the guy who used to own the piece of land. And there used to be a huge house that or mansion that was on the site or on the park site, and that is not reflected in any piece of like heritage or interpretation within the park. And so, like, even in terms of like me using my creativity, I think, I've been speaking to him about the potential to create small pieces of interpretation that describes his family's story within the park, so that other people who have started using the park a lot more because of lockdown can actually find out about the heritage and the culture of the place that they live within. And I think that sort of localized scenario is throughout every community, and every person has probably got a very similar experience. But I think the other thing is definitely that putting creativity at the heart of change for us has been something that we've been acutely aware of, and think that it should be something that's right at the top of the agenda. I think when lockdown happened in Scotland and in Glasgow, we immediately went to an economic recovery team, but we didn't really talk about a creative recovery team. And I think that that's something that should be very much being addressed. I think it is something that we're addressing within Scotland at the moment. But the fact that the first thing that happened was the protection of the economy, which is necessary, but creativity can be part of that conversation, and it shouldn't be excluded from it. So I think that's, for us, that has been a really strong purpose of after the pandemic, is to allow creativity to be part of the conversation about Glasgow in particular.
And how have you managed to, I guess, navigate that space? How easy or hard has it been to bring together the policy and planning environment with the creative, imaginative approaches you're working on?
So I think like the summer school that we mentioned earlier, after the pandemic summer school, was actually something that when we done that, we had a design panel. So we invited councillors, also people from like a Scotland-wide decision making perspective. So we had people from Sustrans, which is the effectively the cycling and active travel company or a government organisation within Scotland. We also had Creative Scotland people on the design panel, and so we were getting the people who had submitted to the summer school to present directly to these decision makers, and also to the councillors, who are able to take some of these ideas with the new legislation that is within Glasgow, for example, like spaces for people. Like some of these ideas can immediately be actioned because they've been developed. So I think that's one way that we have bridged it, is to effectively just be the conduit between the designers and also between the decision makers. So that's something that I think we would like to take elsewhere, and not only within Glasgow, but expand that to a Scotland-wide scenario and do something similar. But I think that's like a key way to we're now at the point of speaking to the council about the potential to get ownership of land within the city to test some of these ideas, but also the potential to have this sort of summer school repeat, every quarter or every half a year, that we have different designers connect up with communities and develop ideas alongside them to then present to the councillors.
Okay. Thank you. I want to come back to some questions around value and intellectual property and so on, that hopefully we'll all move towards as a conversation between the four of us. For now, though, JK, some stuff from you about, you started to talk about it already, actually, in your intro, about purpose and meaning, and I guess the role of the artist and the collectives that you work with. Has that shifted?
Yes. Mm-hmm. In the beginning of the pandemic, it was a big debate if we should like continue making work or just taking rests. But I think from where we're coming from, in the context of the Philippines, no, we are a very performative country. We are performing for survival, but also because of that, I think in the beginning of the pandemic, what was important is to streamline the organization of care for artists and for those who can move forward and do something, and those who can deal with the pandemic and create works, go ahead. But we, as organizations, we need to support them and provide the infrastructures where people can test again and can fail again and can learn faster again. But those who would like to step back and take care of themselves, we should give them that choice and that opportunity. Um, so I think now we are going towards the idea, the conversation of directionality of our purpose and of our making. Clearly, when a lot of performances went online and a lot of artists have been creating work online, the floodgates have opened. You know, there's in the Philippines and in some parts, or in my conversation with artists, especially in Asia, a lot of people became more interested in performance and in community engagement because now they can access it. So listening to that, um, there's also new challenges of how to create, how to be responsible in the works that we do. I think some of my colleagues now are talking about rights, intellectual rights, because there's a renewed interest, and at the same time we are in heavy lockdowns. Um, I think one of the bigger challenge for artists is how to replicate their works, replicability of works. How now a lot of us are creating toolkits so that people can replicate that, or create their own versions of that work on their own, and we don't need to be there. That's another way of hacking the system. But again, now artists are thinking so much about sustainability. Is that a sustainable way of making, right? Making your work replicable and easily accessed by a lot of people. But the good thing is that because there's a demand, or there is a public need that is becoming more apparent for these works, and then institutions, government institutions, cultural institutions are also shifting their point of view into supporting these works. No, the Cultural Center of the Philippines, for example, had shifted all their programming to becoming cultural programming in response to the pandemic. Uh, Capacitating artists, psychological first aids, and community engagement. These have been part of their programming. It shifted a lot. Yeah, now I think the roles also shifted because suddenly people have time. Artists have time to be engaged in mutual aids, in providing food, or even creating aid. So I think the bigger question now, because we are more involved in a lot of, of social exchanges, how do we rethink our practice in terms of not categorizing, oh, this is art making, this is like social work, this is performance is not essential, you know. Yeah, so I think one of my point here is with the idea of how to create, how to turn performance as an essential need. How can we find ways to articulate that? How can we say that it is essential? Basically, of course, by shifting the mode of production, the way to create performance, and in acknowledging the possibility of performance as an essential need. Definitely, the role of the artist is shifting, especially now. You're leaving the black box and becoming more and more one with the people, even if it's online. Sorry, I think I just need to mention a last point, where even though our collaborations and exchanges are online, we have been telling our artists that the people who are engaging are on the ground. Sometimes it's easier to exchange online, but it's so difficult to create a performance for my neighbor. So now there's that hyper locality that is shifting the way we are looking at engagement. Yeah.
It's a thread that's coming through from all of you, the need to be grounded in the community that you're in, probably a more urgent feeling. Does anyone want to pick up on anything anyone else has been saying? Is there any, just give you the chance to come back on anything, or no? Okay.
I just
Go on, Emily, go on.
Well, I just think the work that Graham is doing to kind of centralize a creative recovery is essential, and it's something that I'd love. I mean, if Edinburgh is doing it well, fantastic, because I don't feel like that's happening anywhere, and it's disheartening, but also. Congratulations on the leadership, I guess. But but also the fact that it didn't happen in Scotland seems to be quite common throughout.
Yeah.
When it's remarkable, we haven't had a pandemic for 100 years. What more would we need at this point than trying to imagine a way out of it? No one's done this before at this level.
And actually, that's exactly where I wanted to go. So that's a brilliant little segue there. What I want us to try and do is move forward into the future gazing bit and think about the distant horizon and it's very difficult to articulate, isn't it? But what imagination and storytelling and big picture visioning, how we can do that from the present day, casting ourselves forward into the future in order to create the connections to be able to build the futures that we're talking about, the fairer, more interdisciplinary, more grounded futures that we're talking about. Have any of you had experience of, well, I know, Graham, you're doing it at the moment, but how is it possible to build those near and far future visions into a world where we can then begin to design them, build them? Any thoughts on that? I'm not going to name you. You're going to have to come in.
I think so. Sorry.
We're going to go Graham first. Graham, then JK.
Well, I think just building on that sort of localized element again, like in terms of that one conversation that I've had with my new pen pal out in Canada, has now led us to be speaking to there's two care homes that are quite close to the park, and they never use the park. There's like a portion of the park which is also like quite underused, but gets quite a lot of sun. So like we're now speaking to them about the potential to create a therapy garden for like the use of the care home, so that they can come and use the space to grow foods and vegetables, but use it as a place for mental health, and addressing that as well. So I think again, just building on if there's an ability, a chance to do something now that is like quite local and small scale, it can then be, I think, like the documentation of that, the way that it is like presented to people in Australia and Philippines, like wherever, it's like, here is a good example of something that has happened, and this is how it's happened, how people have been connected. And then I think a big part of that is conversations like what we're having right now, and actually connecting people from different parts of the world and what their experiences are. So even though we're talking about very local changes, we're also talking about how they can be applied elsewhere in the world. In my opinion, I think that would be a really valuable thing for the future.
JK, can we bring you in? You were going to add something in.
Yes. So now we are channeling all our energies to two platforms. One is a project called Pre-Enactments, where it is important that performance becomes a space for pre-enacting future histories. In that platform uh, we are simulating international criminal court cases against some abuses that are being done during the pandemic, while at the same time we're also pre-enacting what we call transfield communities. So this is inviting audiences and even inviting communities to materialize digitally or on analog narratives of possibilities of togetherness for the future. So it's a database collection of stories generated by communities reenacting the future. Part of that is also what we call the Green Manifesto, because and in the beginning of the year, we've been attempting to streamline the conversation about climate, especially in the Philippines. We are limited to the conversation of uh, biodegradable, non-biodegradable segregation, and like not using plastic straws. But the Green Manifesto project continues documenting practices from different communities, local practices about how they are dealing with climate resilience. So that's a pre-enactment. And another platform is rethinking and reimagining uh, rituals. That's the 7 rituals of Mother Earth. The Philippines and the Filipinos are basically there are a lot of migrants. There's a diaspora, and we're kind of used to this kind of interaction, especially during Christmas, where for the past 10 years. You see family pictures of people having Christmas dinners on Skype with their mothers on Skype because they're working as migrant workers abroad. So we have been developing new ways of coming together in these rituals. But also because now in the pandemic we cannot grieve and be physically in the wake of our friends or in funerals. So that's also one of those provocations for a lot of artists who are joining us, how to rethink that, because this pandemic will be here for the next 2 years, I guess, and also shifting the way we are coming together.
Yeah. I suppose I'll say this, and then Emily, maybe ask you if you want to bring anything else into that. I suppose the thing that's in my head as I can hear the methodologies and I can hear the practices and I can hear the ways of embedding huge imaginations into thinking differently. How are you paying people? What's the transaction here, and is that an issue? Do we need to talk about it, or anyone? Emily? Oh, I think you muted. Are you?
Apologies. A classic 2020 error.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's complex. We're looking at different kinds of contracting arrangements with people that can involve pauses, I guess, and sort of stages of work. But it does gnaw at me. The other thing that ethically gnaws at me is that for a lot of artists, they're having to transform what they do, and the question remains, how are we going to pay for them to redo their work? I also had a big conversation with our artists the other day where it's not the same for everybody, right? And for some people, they're already in the position where they can, they're interested to, and they have the capacity to switch up how their practices work. But for others, they are 25 years into an art form and the collaborations that come with it. And I want to hold space for the craft and the expertise that they have. And I don't really want them to suddenly create something else. I want to support them to still make theatre in this instance, or performance. But I guess, so yeah, the money of it is really challenging. And the only answer in some respects is to kind of, for me, has been to kind of break down and reorganize the model. So both accept more responsibility for some and then create different kinds of platforms where we're distributing less amongst more people, if that makes sense. Yeah. But I mean, as JK, you were talking so beautifully as ever, I was thinking about, we did a call for proposals, and we selected about 12 artists to commission them to create housewarming gifts, I guess, for when we do throw a party to reopen. And the irony is that now we are trying to plan that party. When you talk to people about the kind of party they want to come to, they have an idea of a party that is sweaty and bodies up against each other and sparkles on the floor. And I think when I think more deeply about the logistics of the party that we can create, but also more authentically what people will need, we're actually thinking about a party or whatever, a housewarming that is very gentle, that is super safe, that is accessible in the same way that this conversation is, and offers a consistency. I think that is the kind of experience most people will be comfortable with, even if they're longing for, that proximity and the intimacy that we're so craving. I think actually, we're trying to think more deeply into what we'll truly be ready for in 5-6 months' time, if we're lucky.
Yeah, if we're very lucky. There's a question come in that, let's try and thread this into this conversation, that says, what do the arts look like in 2050? Which I'd like us to try and build into what we're talking about at the moment, because I think we talk about the future, and actually what I'm hearing you guys say is diversity and variety and plurality are fundamentally important, and are alongside hyperlocality, are the keys to unlocking whatever we're looking at, which means we're talking about futures and journeys and multiple destinations. And I suppose if we're going to talk about what do the arts look like in 2050, and we're talking about plurality, how do we do that journeying? How do you hold those things together? Graham, do you want to come in there?
So I guess I can maybe use an example of one of the summer school submissions that we had was from a classical musician who she had approached us and said that she needs some help to produce her piece, but effectively what she wanted to do was take ownership of a space within Glasgow and start performing in it that was like outdoors and completely different from where you would normally experience classical music. So we worked alongside her to go underneath the Kingston Bridge, which is in Glasgow is effectively the largest sort of car bridge within the city. It has these sort of monolithic pillars that come down, and we just went, and there's a car park underneath there, which is sorely underused at the moment. And we just recorded her playing some music. So when we asked the question of what do the arts look like in 2050, I think that in a lot of cases it's about how we diversify what the type of art is and what it could where it can be performed. So in her case, I think she realizes that she's probably not going to play within a concert hall for the next 2 years. And as a result, she wants to be able to continue to, ply her trade, and so she's diversifying, and I think that's where we're trying to help her produce or curate this space into something that is different. So when I was talking earlier about the potential of getting some sites for our areas within Glasgow city boundary, that's potentially one of them that we're looking at as getting ownership of that and turning it into a creative space for different performing artists.
We've got a video actually. Can we play in? Are we able to do that? Play in Graham's video. So place-based work has been a thing for a while, and lots of people have been doing it. But what I'm interested in here is that there's a moment of need, in this case articulated by an artist. It probably meets moments of need that we could gather, you've probably gathered actually, Graham, articulated by people living in cities, to do with feeling uplifted, to do with feeling connected. And what you're doing, you mentioned the word conduit earlier, is holding a space between those two things in order to allow connections to begin to happen. And I wonder actually if what we're bubbling out here is these methodologies that are around connecting people, ideas, and spaces with one another in order to allow the energy that we need to imagine ourselves better, to thrive. Has anyone got any? JK, did you want to bring anything? No, right. Did anyone want to?
Yeah. I'm thinking about it. Yeah, it's a beautiful question. Yeah. It's very challenging in my context now. In Manila, when we talk about space, because I think the socio-economic differences among people, that's the you just crossed a little, you just across the street, suddenly it's the shanties, and then a few minutes from the shanties you'll see a gated village, and the artist is always like becoming, or like providing this third space where people from these different spaces gather and can come together. So I've been ruminating. I've been thinking so much about that, like this imaginary, imagined and materialized new spaces that can exist in between these borders that we have set. Um, so now that most of the artists in the Philippines are really going on digital platforms, the digital also becomes like this third space, this new space again, where we can gather and we can exchange these different energies from people you don't normally see or come around with, people you don't normally share your space. So yeah, um, that thinking about that with regards to your question, how we are hacking that. Now there's an illusion that we have erased borders, just because we're going digital, but actually it's becoming more and more to go on the ground. Like the poor communities judged to generate this disease, or this COVID disease, just because there's no access to anything, to medical. Same as when in other countries the migrant communities are still not accessed, or still more off limits to a lot of people. And the ones who are bridge those. So in the future, I hope we create more of these bridging spaces.
Can I bring you in here to talk a little bit more about the tension then between overseeing a dedicated art space and some more sighted work, and how that bridging works, and how those two things might connect in the future?
Is that me?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, the sound did that. Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, to be honest, when I'm thinking about next year's program, I feel like there's all sorts of dissolving occurring between, yes, the digital space, but we're also trying to work with artists to think about remote delivery, about outdoor spaces, about old technologies like email or phone, as well as, yes, how we get back into performance spaces eventually. So I'm not sure that I have much of an answer. We're working closely with artists to figure it out, like JK was describing. I think we're all in a deep collaboration as we try to answer these questions together.
from the people you're working with, listening to the people you're working with, I think audiences and artists, if we can try and hold, in fact, I hate the distinction, but if we can try and hold the people who view or listen and also the people who make together in our heads, are you experiencing a pull away from the performance venue and also from some a pull towards? Like, what's the lay of the land? Like, is there excitement? JK's talking about a kind of excitement about being in these third spaces, the mediated spaces. I hear both. I hear people who are like, yeah, breaking out, freedom almost. And some people who are like just desperate to get back into the more formal environment that is set up well for performance or exhibition.
Yeah, I mean, that's not new though. I mean, those are kind of, I guess, questions that artists have been considering for some time. I think I think what is new is the the challenges to kind of face-to-face collaboration. And I think one of the questions that has continually needed to sort of be raised and fought and thought through is that the assumption that digital is accessible to all is problematic. And I think and that this mode of interaction is the kind that can really suit everybody. It's just not true. So there are some artists whose entire careers have been founded on touch, on the way that one person can be present with another, and that's a form of deep communication. And so I think there's the dissolving of methodologies and approaches and tactics that needs to be considered at all times to kind of pick up lots of different tools for different kinds of people.
I'm going to move us back into the specifics of the future gazing bit and try for us to talk a little bit about that vision piece and who gets to, at the moment, create the vision and how we can shift towards a world in which maybe more people are involved in the visioning and the imagining. I can hear, I know we can all talk for a long time about how we can do that. The bit of the puzzle that I feel is missing, certainly in the way I work with the people I work with, is the connections across boundaries. So can we return a little bit to that and how you guys are managing to, whether you are or where you're experiencing barriers if you're not, how you're managing to connect beyond the world of art practice? Well, creative practice, I should say. It's not specifically art practice.
I can jump in, or Graham, you can.
Let's go Emily first, go down to Graham.
Sure. I mean, we have an advantage at Arts House because we are part of city government, as I mentioned earlier. So our colleagues work across different parts of the community. And as I said, through some parts of our program, we've been working with climate scientists, with emergency service workers, with the Doherty Institute, who are responsible for vaccines and immunology in Melbourne. We've been working for them for a number of years. So the expertise that they bring and the kind of mutual benefit that they see of being in touch with artists on a regular basis means, I really feel that is the most viable way for cultural practice to evolve, where there is multiple inputs. And we acknowledge that lots of people are comfortable playing in the dark and being, encouraged to experiment. Actually, that kind of creative energy can come from all different kinds of places. But artists are good at it. They're particularly good at it, and that's what they can bring to a community.
And so how did the organisation, and I suppose you within the organisation, create that feeling of mutual trust and benefit?
I think that's like community engagement 101. Like you start with relationships, you start with, and they become friendships, and then those are things that can be relied upon to build meaningful work.
Yeah. Graham, have you had a similar experience? Mute. Welcome.
So I was just wanting to say about when we started up after the pandemic, the first thing that we actually did was work alongside Jamie Cook, who is from RSA Scotland, and he's one of the sort of biggest proponents of universal basic income within Scotland. And so we worked alongside him when we seen that Amsterdam was looking at the donut economics model of how we can change our economy. And I think that for us was we wanted after the pandemic to be something that was cross-sectoral, and it wasn't something that was just artistic led or just about art. It was also about how creativity can engage with things such as the economy and like how we design that. And I think that Kate Roarth, the book that she's done, the work that she's done on donut economics has been fantastic, and it's something that we could be applying within a much more local level than what to as much like Amsterdam is doing. And I think that kind of comes back to what we were talking about earlier, what you asked earlier in terms of, how do we pay people for the work that they are currently doing, and if we had some form of universal basic income that people can be contributing to these ideas, but also there's some there's money that is coming in, then it's one way of doing that. So I think that for me, we've been trying very much to engage with people who are out with the creative sector. So even as an example, like my partner is a doctor, so like to have her insight and her expertise on what is happening, I think is really valuable. But she has a completely different viewpoint on like how the city is designed and how art and design is used within that process. So I think that's something that we've been talking about as part of the initiative, as well as the potential to have what we want to call after the pandemic coffee mornings, where we have someone from, like, say, an urban designer who then talks to someone from a completely different discipline, and that allows them to have a conversation over a coffee, over Zoom, and it is just, we would ask them to respond to a series of questions, and it can, I think it's an opportunity for us to have conversations with different people from different disciplines.
And in the future, if you were to replicate this, so if we were to roll it out into different environments, is it that it's a methodology that's bought by, for example, a local authority, or how would it work?
Yes, if it like I don't think that when we started this, we literally it was a few of us who were sitting at home and we had nothing to do and we wanted to respond creatively to what was happening, because we were sitting inside our flats just looking at the outside with no way of accessing it, but realizing that there was these challenges. So I think from our side, we done it. We done it because we wanted to do something positive and proactive at the height of the pandemic, and we have said from the start that we are happy to share how we have started that up, and help other people set up something that is similar within their city or within their town. And so I think, as you say, it's a methodology rather than like necessarily a project. If someone wanted to set up after the pandemic like in a different city, then we would be more than happy to facilitate that and work alongside them.
JK, can I bring you in here? Because this to me resonates with some of the stuff you're talking about around toolkits and, a way of embedding creative practice within the world rather than the moment of product, for want of a better way of describing it.
Yes. Yeah, I'd like to respond to Emily. It's also these people coming from different fields like science and social work and art making. What bind us together now is not just our shared joy, but also shared precarity. Suddenly, okay, what do we need to do with the world, or what do we need to do with our immediate communities? So, recently, urban planners and policy makers, at least the next generation, we've been gathering around together with some people from medicine, all rethinking about citizenship and engagement. The artists are now playing a big role in terms of communications design, what narratives we are putting out there. It's not just responding to this time of disinformation or misinformation, but also I think the artists have totally embraced the role in not just truth telling, but also sense making and creating narratives of hope, and narratives of what I always say, like possible futures. So, but now I think we want our practice to be more informed. And at the same time, there's that synergy that's being generated now. You asked a while ago, like, what is how are we sustaining this, or how it is being funded, or how people are being paid. That's also one thing that's being we need to rethink about that, because from the Philippines perspective, we operate under the idea that we don't have an organized infrastructure of artistic support or artistic practice. We have only one commission who's like helping out, providing grants, for example. But because of our exchanges with people in education or even in development, that's where now that they are also seeing the necessity, or the necessariness of these collaborations with artists, a lot of the fund and a lot of the funds are being channeled towards supporting artists also. So even though it's not coming from arts funding, now because of these exchanges, we are making sure that it's not just sustainable. Now, I think one thing that shifted also is this conversation that we got from the climate conversation, not just but also regenerative. So it's thinking a lot about like how does this everything become like a regenerative in its nature. That's why I talk about replicability, and also what are the shifts in the currencies that we're exchanging. Even though we're not getting as much money, but the currency of knowledge exchange, currency of protection, civic protection. Yeah. So those are some thoughts from here.
Yeah. So the thing that's really encouraging, my mind's going like this at the moment. The thing that's really encouraging, I think, is that we're in the middle of incremental change anyway. We can talk about far futures and we can talk about imagining where we want to get to in the vision, but actually there's a lot of it going on. So JK, what you're describing is an incremental innovation cycle. And you're saying that in your context in the Philippines, the artists are in the middle of it already. Clearly, Emily, you have a setup where you've managed to embed artistic practice within a conversation about who people are in the community and how they live. And Graham, you're demonstrating to us what's possible with the City Council coming on board from a kernel of an idea. And these incremental innovations and changes lead eventually to the radical change that I think we're all, in this group anyway, like feel our hearts leaping towards. Paul Hamlin, I don't know if they still have it, Paul Hamlin are a funder, big trust in the UK, used to talk about innovation being both incremental and radical, and how we needed to hold space for both. And that, to me, seems to be one of the things that's coming out of this. The future is tomorrow as well as 50 years down the track, right? We're getting towards the end of the session. A question did come in around digital inclusivity that we've started touching on, actually. I think, I'm reading between the lines within the question. There are challenges, aren't there, around keeping conversation going with everyone. Emily, you were referring very clearly to this, using predominantly digital tools. Given the direction of the 21st century, any of you have any thoughts about holding space for people who wouldn't necessarily be able to access the environments that the more privileged amongst us can get to immediately? It doesn't need to be exclusively digital inclusivity. I guess this is a question about making sure that all voices get to come to the table. How do we do that?
May I answer?
Yep.
I was in conversation with some artists a few days ago, and we were talking about like this digital inclusivity. In fact, we realized that being online, we have this idea that more people are accessing our work, but actually, it's not being accessed by people who are different from our economic standing. So, for example, when we need to work with disenfranchised people, of course, definitely, it's so difficult to access these conversations online. So, I think we are coming to this agreement that if we are creating works digitally or exchanging digitally, it should have ground translation, a direct ground translation. And also the same way that when I think the future is, where we're doing work on the ground, digital becomes an extension and expansion, and not just not like black and white, not like digital is different, etc. But now we are learning new behaviors where it's becoming more organic for some people to look at digital as an expansion and extension of our work on the ground. And the same way, we need to demand or ask or make it an SOP for us that our digital exchanges have a way to get on the ground. Yes.
Yeah. Hybridity. So the hybrid forms and allowing things to traverse between different media more readily. And yeah. Graham and Emily, did you want to? Graham?
I think, well, just to, I think like one of the good parts of the sort of the more digital that we've went is there was a comment that someone had posted on a social media which just said that they had like mobility issues, and so for them to like the pandemic actually resulted in their work being what they were judged on rather than like their ability to go into a physical office. So I think that in terms of like the way that we work is actually the flexibility of either being able to work in an office or work from home, or like a sort of a variation on each of those is something that can be really beneficial for a lot of people as well. So I think I don't want to take up much more time. If Emily's got some comments on that, that would be good.
Emily, will I bring you in?
I'm still thinking about what JK said about digital exchanges also existing on the ground. I think that's a really great provocation because, there's something about, I guess that brings us back to what we were saying earlier about perhaps when we think about inclusivity, or like inclusivity is a sort of an abstracting of a behavior and an approach And I think if what we really mean is the including of less privileged people, we have to start with the people and the relationships and the individuals, and not sort of general communities, but like specific particular communities that we really commit to for a reason. So yeah, I guess I'm bringing us back to that hyperlocal, neighbourly approach, where we do rub up against people who disagree with us, who are not the same, and have to find a way through. And I think if that's the only gift from 2020, then it wouldn't be a bad one, because polarization and nationalism is getting us nowhere. So if we really have to take this year to look in the eye of people that it was more easy to avoid when we were out and about doing our previous lives, then that could be a very beneficial thing for us all.
Okay, I'm going to stop us there on that note. What a great way to end. I think, the key takeaway for me is that we're talking about mediated spaces. We're talking about plurality of vision and connection. We're talking about hyperlocal experiences that can be shared between localities. So it's not that each hyperlocal environment exists in isolation. They're existing in a connected infrastructure. And that's what all of you seem to be driving towards, using slightly different methodologies, but all pushing urgently towards. There was loads I wrote down around things like rituals and resilience, and again more about this idea of mutuality and place-based working that we could have gone into more. And maybe in the Zoom after this, there'll be an opportunity to pick some of that stuff up. To remind everyone, we're going to take a 10-minute break, so you can pop to the loo or make a cup of tea. But do join us afterwards, those of us who can come and have a chat on Zoom about some of the stuff we've been talking about. Can I say thank you again to the BSL interpreters who have done an incredible job. Also to our live captioning team. Wow. Thanks to Jenny and Emma behind the scenes, who have organised this series of talks, and to the vision mixers who are doing all the tech stuff for us. And also thank you to you guys, Emily, Graham, JK, thank you for giving your time. We're going to go, and we'll see some of you, I hope, in 10 minutes or so. So it's 12:15 now, so 12:25 on Zoom. Thank you all.